Yes, I wanted to prove Genesis. That's the first book of the Bible, so that's the most important book. That's the most.
Because it's first? Is that like because we're in the center?
Well, it's not written for. Well, yeah. Well, I wanted to talk about Noah's Ark.
Okay.
I wanted to start with something in Genesis 6:3 here. It says that after the flood, no man will live past 120 years, which is very amazing since no man after the flood has lived to be 120 years. The oldest man that ever lived was a Japanese man who lived to be 100.
And how do we know that anybody? How do we know that anybody ever lived past 120 years?
And why does specifically what the Bible have to say about that? What is that?
I mean, if I wrote a book and said no one is ever going to be 15 feet tall after this time, and I claimed that there used to be people that were 15 feet tall, would you say like, wow, how did they know that there wouldn't be any 15-foot tall people 2,000 years later? Yeah,
but I just think it's amazing with all the scientific discoveries that no man has lived to be over 120. But there was a woman that lived to be 122 in France, but
that's a woman.
In Genesis.
And they matter less, as we know.
It doesn't say man.
Right, but I'm not convinced that people were living as long as the Bible claims before that was written.
Yeah, I think you would have to demonstrate.
I think that the idea is that you have a myth that basically is claiming that people lived to be, 900 years old or whatever, 500 years old. And then they said, oh, but this doesn't happen anymore. And it's like, I'm claiming that it never did happen.
Yeah,
that we have no evidence that it happened.
Well, I wanted to start with just a little bit of evidence about the oceans.
Okay.
The Pacific Ocean is really huge. It's huge. It's 165 million square kilometers. So all the continents of the Earth could fit inside the Pacific Ocean. And when you're looking at the average land elevation of the world, it's around 2,756 feet. So that's about half a mile. And when you just look at the depth of the Pacific Ocean, the average depth is about 14,000 feet, and the max depth is Mariner's Trench is about 5 miles deep. So because that's the question atheists always ask. They go, where did the water go? Well, it went into the ocean.
I'm not sure that's a discussion that I've heard a lot.
Well, I don't even ask it because I don't believe there ever was a global flood. So I'm not asking where did the water go. I'm saying just prove that there was actually a global flood. Or even if there was a global flood, prove that the stories that are in the Bible about it are correct. Prove that it happened because of a 40-day and night rain. Prove that, you know what I mean? I don't understand the relevancy. Like, even if we had a global flood at some point, which, it is funny because if the entire Earth was covered with water, I do understand the question of like, how come it's not still covered with water? But the point is, so what? So let's say that we look at the science and there was a global flood, and later on we had these myths that talked about it, just like people along river areas write about their floods. So they wrote these myths about a flood, and so what?
Well, it's the Hebrew word is mabu, and that means it was a global flood because there's a lot of creationists.
Okay, I'm just saying, let's say that despite the fact that we could get into an argument about whether or not there was a global flood, let's just say for the sake of your argument that there was a global flood, and that somehow the water then redistributed into the oceans, and that there was the Hebrews who wrote down some myths about this. So what?
Well, if you're a Christian, you got to prove Genesis first. So proving Noah's Ark is pretty difficult, but I'm trying. So.
Well, I don't necessarily think that that's true because I have a lot of Christian friends who don't take Genesis literally, and they call it parables. And so I'm not sure that I accept your premise that you have to prove Genesis.
Yeah, you absolutely don't. Yeah. But if you want to go that route, it's not relevant to whether or not there's a God. But I mean, even if events occurred, it doesn't mean that a God was driving it.
Well, I disagree with that. So
what's your evidence?
I don't know.
That's what because you give a lot of statistics.
Well, all right. The record for the most amount of rainfall in 1 minute is in Maryland in July 4th, 1956. It rained 1.22 inches in 1 minute.
Let me try this again. Let's assume for the sake of your argument that there was historically a global flood. and that later some people wrote some myths about it. So what?
I don't have the artifact right in front of me, but I believe it's called the Weld-Blondel prism. They found this prism, and it has basically a bunch of Sumerian kings, and it has basically, after the flood, all their ages drop dramatically.
You lost me on the relevance, because again, what Tracie asked is, okay, we accept for the purposes of this discussion, we accept that a global flood happened. Our question is, okay, so what? Let's assume there was a global flood. How do you prove that a God caused that?
Well, who else would cause a global flood?
That's not answering the question, though.
No. Yeah, where is the evidence that a God would be behind such a thing?
Especially because we know on natural disasters on a smaller scale than a global flood, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, all that, we understand decently well the natural mechanisms for those. So why would we not assume that there was a natural mechanism for that? Why would we jump to, well, this is special enough that it had to have been a God? It couldn't just be the natural mechanism.
Yeah, is every flood caused by a God? Are regional floods caused by lesser gods?
Well, I believe God is sovereign, so to answer your question, yes.
Okay, so then the real question isn't really about whether or not a flood occurred. Like, let's just say that there's a flood in Tennessee, and you're saying that God is behind that flood. We can just talk about that flood. What makes you think there's a God behind that flood?
I guess that's an interesting question, but for a global flood to occur, you'd have to believe it's some kind of supernatural.
No, you wouldn't.
No, you don't at all.
No, you wouldn't.
No, not at all.
I would have an event. Wait a minute. I would just have an event that was like a global flood where the water redistributed into these other areas that became the oceans. And even if it was counterintuitive to scientific models, the answer to that would be, wow, that's a really weird incident that we currently can't explain. We don't know what caused it. You're saying that you do accept that a God is the cause of that, and I'm asking you where you're getting that.
Well,
as opposed to you don't know.
Job,
sorry.
Well, if you look at the book of Job, that is, according to most creation scientists, the oldest book in the Bible. And it says something about let me see here.
Well, my question is why is it relevant what the Bible says? What we're asking for is actual evidence of your position. You can point to, I can point to any book that says anything. So then I guess we regress a little further and say, before you can present what is in the Bible as evidence, you have to prove to me that it's relevant
because,
evidence.
Because, for example, let's say the Wall Street Journal covers a flood in Tennessee. I don't point to that and say, whoa, God. Because look, the Wall Street Journal wrote about it, and it really happened.
I think what a lot of this comes back to is our perspective, because from our perspective, a global flood is a really big freaking deal, right? But if we look at the scale of the universe, a global flood, that's small potatoes. That's not really that big of a deal. Literally anything having to do with the Earth is insignificant on a cosmic scale. So, we can look at the formation of stars and black holes and all these cosmic concepts. Like, why are we appealing to a global flood instead of those? And I think that has a lot to do with our limited perspective as beings that exist on the planet. So I'm curious why the fixation on that specific event as well. So many questions.
Well, I guess we can go back to the beginning of Genesis if you want to.
Well, I'm not super interested in that, though.
Well, no, but if we go back to the beginning of Genesis, right? In the beginning, God created. Yeah. And so my question is, where's the evidence God is responsible for anything? Where is the evidence that God exists and causes anything?
Well, in the Old Testament, I believe there's 12 verses in all the Old Testament books that he spread out the heavens.
Okay, so let's
wait, the Bible says God did a lot of stuff, and you're saying God does everything. And so my question is, where do we have evidence that a God exists and that God is causing stuff?
I think the better way to phrase the question is, can you demonstrate the truth of anything you believe without referencing the Bible?
That's fair enough.
So can you?
It was science that discovered that the universe was expanding in, I believe, in the 20s, Hubble did. But the Bible knew that already thousands of years before.
Even if that were true, why does that matter?
Because how did they know that?
How do you know they knew it?
People guess things right all the time.
Right, there's all kinds of cosmologies on the planet. Just because you had one that had something right, and I'm not even saying it did, I'm just saying for the sake of argument, let's say that out of all the hundreds and thousands of cosmologies that cultures have come up with, somebody said something that seems to match what actually was later discovered to be true. Is it just the the capacity of a culture to come up, like they hit that lucky point? But I don't even think that it necessarily was that lucky, because there's nothing that specific in the Bible.
Well, yeah, and that's my
science.
question is there any of it that's not like the Nostradamus thing, where it's like you look at some very vague words that he used and said, oh gosh, he predicted 9/11. Like almost everything that I've heard in the Bible where they say like, ooh, they knew this ahead of time,
yeah.
It was more like, they said, this thing will happen during the daytime.
In fact, if you want to see scientific claims claimed for a holy book, you can't get any bigger than Muslims in the Quran. Like they have like just loads and loads of scientific facts that they say the Quran contains and that it was aware of like way before. And to me, when you go and read it, it's not really specific. It doesn't really. People are going back and reading it that way.
Well, I think Genesis is very specific. For example, look at God created light before the sun. There's different forms of electromagnetic radiation. There's X-rays, there's radio waves. Of course there was light. If you believe in the Big Bang, you believe that there was light before the sun.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is just because they wrote that, God created light and then later he creates the sun and the moon, and then you say, wow, we know that there were other sources of light than the sun, right? They knew there were other sources of light beside the sun too, because they saw, for example, stars, and they may not have known that the moon was reflective, and so they saw the moon as a source of light. So they saw other, well, the moon would have been later as well, but like stars, for example, were visible to those people, and they know they're a source of light, right?
Fire.
So, I mean, they understand that light comes from more than the sun, so I just don't know why you would look at that myth and sort of look for, you're painting a target around the arrow, right? So you're saying like, there's where the arrow hit, let's go back and paint the target around it and then say it was right. We don't really know what they were talking about. This is an ancient myth. Who knows what they meant when they said God created light and dark, and what were they describing? I have no idea. And I don't think that you can say that you really have an idea too. You just simply look at certain scientific models and you say, oh, I think I can match it up to that. Well, yeah, sure, you could do that with any holy book. But that doesn't demonstrate a God.
True, but we can only look at the evidence that's presented to us. So,
right.
So where is it? Aside from the Bible, where is it?
Well, the Bible's the claim, and I'm trying to demonstrate that. I guess that's my point.
But you keep referring back to the claim to demonstrate the claim. So that's, I'm not understanding where you make the leap.
I understand. I don't know where you want to go from this.
It comes back to my question of, can you point to something other than the Bible to demonstrate the truth of what you're...
All right. Most of the water in the flood came from the springs of the great deep. So like geysers, if you look at Old Faithful and Yellowstone, that's what reminds me of the global flood.
I guess what you're trying to do, though, is say that there's this book and it has some things written in it, and I think some of those things correspond to reality. And I'm saying there are tons of books that have things in them that correspond to reality. I don't think that it proves that a God exists. So let's just, for the sake of argument, we'll give you that too. You have this book, it has things that are, describe realities. So where is the demonstration that a God is behind any of these realities, that a God is behind this book? Where is your demonstration of that a God exists?
I understand. It's a worldview. If I look at something and you look at it differently, I understand that. But if I look at...
What we're asking, though, is for you to provide evidence of that.
We agree on these realities, right? We agree on the realities. We may have some disagreements about whether or not the book accurately describes those realities. I'm saying I don't care if it does accurately describe them or not, even though I don't think it does, because even if you had a book that accurately described these realities in a way that we couldn't understand, we'd have a book that we don't understand that is offering up something that, how did they know that? Let's say it described in detail, like a cosmology that we later came to find evidence for, and it was very robust. I guess the question then would be, we still don't know that a God is responsible for that. We don't know what would be responsible for that. We'd have to investigate to discover what was responsible for that, wouldn't we?
Correct.
So what I'm thinking of
what you're looking at is, how is God behind this?
I think there would have to be an existent God to have a God be responsible for any of it. And so at the end of the day, if we can list causes, we could list a million things that you believe God is responsible for. And my question is, if there is no God, then God is not responsible for it. If there is a God, he may or may not be, or that God may or may not be responsible for it. But the first step would be, can we at least demonstrate that there is a God that has the capacity to do these things and would want to do them? And did them, right? Like
that's fair.
So
no, it's not the easiest thing to prove Noah's Ark. So
I mean, even if there was a big boat,
I was going to say, yeah. Even like I think even if we accept that there's a global flood, we accept that there was a Noah's Ark, and all of that, I still don't understand how that would get you to God. Because I keep thinking, like, let's say I read a book and there are some super eerie similarities between that story and my life story. What I think of is, that's an interesting coincidence. I don't think, oh, this person was predicting my life story.
Right, and because the people writing the myth, if they were writing a myth about a flood and a boat and whatever, and then they ascribe it to their particular God based on their religious beliefs of that culture at that time that put down that record, it doesn't mean that they're correct in what they're assuming is the cause, even if they were describing accurately the events.
That's fair.
Right?
So you're an atheist now, right?
No, I'm not saying that you're an atheist. I will say that I think that this is another good one for the blog. I don't know if you've ever posted to our blog, the Atheist Experience blog. If you go to our homepage, there's a link to it on the left-hand side. And I think that this would be another issue where maybe back and forth with your ideas on this and maybe other people kind of questioning it. Because I feel like at this point, I'm doing a disservice because I'm just repeating myself and in asking the same question, like where's the evidence there's a God behind it? It's not even and even when I give that, oh, hey, let's just say these events occurred so that we don't have to argue about the events, where's the evidence that it's a God causing it? I think that's the crux of it. I would say put a little bit of thought into that question and then maybe go post at the blog when you've had a little bit of time to ruminate about this and see if other people maybe have other ideas about it. And maybe somebody will, be even supportive. I don't know.
All right. I appreciate you taking my call.
Thank you, Andrew.
Take care.
Bye.